Retro.
Hello there. This is James Arnold Taylor, the voice of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and you're listening to Dennis and Jay on Podcast Stardust. Their behavior is continuously unexpected. So uncivilized.
Welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. I'm Dennis Keithley.
And I'm Jay Krebs.
And it's time for the next installment of our Darth Bane book club. But before we get into that, Jay, remind everybody what our social media contacts are.
Yes, you can very easily find us on Instagram and Facebook at Podcast Stardust.
All right. The digital line, the signal's boosted to maximum output. The shield is down. We are now broadcasting to the galaxy. So we're looking at chapters 13 through 15 in part 5 of our book club here, Jay. And you've got us set up with some really great discussion points and things here. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, me too. And it's always so wonderful to come back to this month after month because it's never soon enough, but but it's just so great to immerse ourselves in the details of the story.
Indeed.
All right, so why don't you go ahead and read us our summary?
Okay, so Bane is forced to confront weakness, failure, and the realization that raw power alone isn't enough to survive in the Sith Academy. At the same time, new alliances start forming, manipulation becomes just as important as strength, and we start digging deeper into what power might actually mean in Sith culture. There's a lot here about identity, survival, and transformation, and we start to see that Bane is beginning to evolve into something far more dangerous than he was before.
Yes. So we've got a lot going on in these 3 chapters for sure. So our story is focusing on a lot of different things here. So we've got basically Bane being transformed, I guess you could say, from his weakness in the previous chapters to kind of finding some new ground here with the help of, as you just said, some interesting types of allies, if you will. So we're going to start right off with chapter 13. And so what's happening with Bane right now is that he understands that he's got this weakness. He's not able to fully tap into the dark side of the Force. And he's calling it this veil that is over him. And it almost reminds me of the way that, you know, when you have something that's misfiring and there's sparks there, but it's just not connecting. And so I feel like that's where Bane kind of sees himself at this point, but he's not completely giving into that quote unquote weakness. He's, despite even being shunned by Kasim, and he's kind of admitting his vulnerability, he does something kind of unexpected at this point. He actually decides to challenge Sirak, much to the disapproval of Kasim. And so just to jog everyone's memory, Sirak is this Zabrak who is considered by many to be potentially the Sithari, which is the equivalent of the chosen one for the Sith. And so Sirak has this reputation of being really untouchable. And a lot of the students tend to steer clear from him. They almost see him as kind of a celebrity in a way. He's got this air of almost like, again, untouchability. And no one's actually ever seen him battle in the ring. But Bane is like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and challenge him. And he's actually, again, he's never seen him battle. He's heard stories from others. He's watched Sirak train. And what he's seen from him is that he describes Sirak's technique as pretty perfect. But, you know, Bane has this kind of inexpert eye, but he sees Sirak is always in complete control and on the attack. And he sees him learning these sequences and mastering sequences much more quickly than the other apprentices. So he thinks, okay, if I'm going to conquer this weakness that I have, I need to call out the most powerful, student in the academy to be able to do this. So he notes that Sirak fights with a double blade, which I think is kind of interesting because the only other real, at the time that this novel was written, the only other real double bladed examples that we've had brings us right back to Darth Bane, or I'm sorry, Darth Maul in
Mhm.
The Phantom Menace. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the famous ones anyway, because
Yeah, exactly.
right, yeah, I mean, there was a prominent double-bladed force users in Knights of the Old Republic, which came out right before this,
Hmm.
but yeah, no, the reference to Maul is inescapable here, and it's
Exactly.
almost too on the nose, but, the red skins a Zabrak with his two, he's got two yellow skin allies and stuff like that, but yeah, using the double blade there is like, I and the thing is that I don't fault Carpesian from doing this because he's giving even like casual Star Wars fans, a reference that they can envision in that
Hmm.
case, and it works.
No, it absolutely does. You're
Mhm.
right. So when Bane calls him out, Sirak thinks that this is a waste of time, but he says he will take great pleasure in Bane's suffering. So at this point, before the fight even begins, what do you think about Bane's decision to do this? Is this brave? Is this something that is kind of this impetus for removing the veil for him? Or is it actually self destructive at this point?
Well, he's a victim of his own success in this case because prior to the fight with Murgath, or even after the fight with Murgath, the Murgath, what's his name? I can't remember. That's
Boharg,
a species. Yeah, Rohard. That's a
the
species. I was
Murkath.
using Murkath. Thank you.
Mhm. Mhm.
Is that basically it became down to him and Sirak were the most two powerful apprentices there. Bane was getting all the special tutelage from the various masters in the university in the academy, and so he noticed he's lost his touch with the Force, and others were beginning to sense it as well, and he was afraid that he was going to become prey for anyone, and so he's trying to head that off, but he can't challenge anybody else because he knew that if he challenged any other apprentice there at the academy, everyone else would see that as weakness on his part. Because look what Sirak does. Sirak doesn't issue challenges to anyone because he believes that everyone is beneath him. So Bane has kind of got to emulate that. The only person he can do is Sirak, the champion. He can only take a shot at the title, is what it comes down to. Why otherwise it'd be like, why are you bidding up on the fifth contender? Why are you bidding up on the eighth contender in the situation? The only thing that he might have done better is, sitting and waiting for a lesser student to challenge him that he might have had a better chance against. But Bane believed he needed to make a statement, and I'm not entirely certain he was wrong, but he was trying to do the fight without actually engaging in the Force and his in those abilities, and was relying on almost the gimmicks. Like, I've seen him do this in practice. I've seen him master those things. And so he's looking for all those little tells in Sirak's form, which was never going to win him this fight. It might against the average person, but not a Force user.
Right. And that's the thing too, is that he's not, he realizes even before he goes into this fight that he may not be able to tap into the Force. So I was thinking to myself, well, maybe what he was sort of hoping for is that through the events of the fight, that maybe it would simulate the same kind of feelings that he had when he inadvertently killed his own father by
Mhm.
imagining his heart being crushed, or when he fought Foharg, almost like a Hulk kind of thing, where he starts to
Right.
transform into the dark side being that he is. But I don't know if he was even actually expecting that to happen. He just wanted to, as you said, make sure that he was asserting himself as being almost worthy, and that completely backfires on him because he starts fighting him, and he sees that Sirak is doing, he names some of the styles, Vapad and then Gemso. And then all of a sudden he starts blending these patterns and doing these things that Bane isn't anticipating. So his plan completely falls apart. And then the next thing you know, and
Such as it was. I
oh
mean,
my
it was,
gosh,
yeah.
yeah, Karpyshyn really hits home with this literally and figuratively. He talks about how first Bane's nose is broken, then his knee, then his cheek and jaw, then his wrist, his elbow, he loses a tooth, and then finally Sirak like force chokes Bane, chucks him up against the wall, and Bane not feels, but they say hears the sound of his ribs crunching.
Yeah.
And so it just really, I mean, Bane literally got the you know what beat out of him at this
Yep.
point. So, I guess though it does beg the question, knowing what we know about Bane later on, with the challenge that Bane gives him at this point, he's superior against Bane. But is he genuinely superior than other students? Or is this, the message that Bane wanted to send, but it backfired, and that now these students are seeing exactly how intimidating Sirak actually is? How do you feel about that?
Well, that's a very broad question. I guess I'd answer it this way, which is the Bane that defeated Forharg, I think, would have defeated Sirak. The guy who was at that moment unafraid to tap into his anger, his hate, his fear, and would have unleashed such a force fury against Sirak, I don't think it would have been a challenge in that situation. And even if it was the Bane that had been diving, and he's going to do this again here in a second as we get into these chapters, the Bane that came to the Academy and immediately started recognizing the value of the transcripts, of the scrolls, of the books that are in that Sith library, and was learning from the masters, that guy was capable of beating Sirak. But he noted chapters ago that the apprentices that were there in the Academy had kind of given up on learning from the past to train at the feet of the masters. And why would you bother spending all this time reading books when you could learn from the Sith Lord? And so, but he fell into that trap when he recognized the value of the wisdom, the accumulated wisdom that was there at the Academy. He was at his best, but then he got caught up in the hierarchy and going out and proving himself. And he was not proving himself in the library. And so anyway, he got away from being him on more than one way, which one, not keeping up with his own secret studies of the manuscripts, and two, chasing that hierarchy. And then I guess three, he lost his passion, is what they basically tell us in the remaining chapters of this. So yeah, Sirak from a brute strength perspective was the elite at that moment in the Academy, and all the other students knew that. But at the end, he's not capable of being the Sithari because he's a little too one-dimensional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and you make a lot of really great points there too. And part of me also thinks that Bane needed this beatdown in order for him to, as you said, kind of retreat back into his former studies, because he had become kind of arrogant in the former chapters with, thinking that, oh, the dark side is so empowering, and he was almost at this point of like a high on the dark side. And so he was starting to neglect those other parts of his studies that really did set him apart. So, I guess maybe an uninjured Bane would have actually become more arrogant, almost like your overconfidence is your weakness kind of thing. So maybe it was kind of a favor to him in some ways that Sirak did him this you know what I mean?
Right, because here's the thing: when there was a cap to his passion before he defeated Fohark, he had rage and the like. But when he defeated Fohark in a way that he didn't necessarily intend, then he realized he was responsible. And this is going to come up over. It's hard to talk about this chapter without talking about the subsequent chapter. So we're just going to have to blend them a little bit. But as he's recovering from this, the thing that he realizes is that He was afraid of his own, essentially his own fear and his own passion. When he defeated Foharg, it made him reflect on what happened with his father. And he realized that night that he took that beating. He was thinking about putting that pressure on his father's heart. And I hope you die. I hope you die. I hope you die. And then his father died. And so he realized he was responsible for his father's death. And that scared him because it was unintended in that moment. And over the course of these 3 chapters, the beatdown by Sirak was the spark that starts to rekindle his passion because he wants revenge. And then, we'll get into what happens with, because that's how he ends up convincing Kasim at the end of all this to start training him again. And then it's Githany that further kindles that flame. And we haven't got to her yet. But the point is just that, yes, what happened with Sirak was necessary for him to become the Sith that he ultimately ends up turning into, because there was a cap on his passion, and then it took both Foharg and Sirak to pull him beyond that, to basically allow him to open up to the full range of his passion and how to deal with it and how not to be limited by his fear of his fear when it comes down to it.
Yeah, and like you said, it's hard to not blend some of this stuff together because I think it actually did do him a favor to make him sort of take a couple steps back. But one thing I thought was really interesting was, and we'll get back to Ruusan and the introduction of Githany here in just a second, but at the end of chapter 13, when Bane wakes up in the Bacta tank, he's basically coming to this epiphany that his life as a powerful Dark Lord is like over, in the Brotherhood. And even though he realizes that the Sith aren't going to just sacrifice him, because all Sith that have any kind of potential whatsoever are more valuable than not. But, he would basically be put to a life of servitude and obedience. And part of him actually wished that Sirak would have finished the job.
Right.
So he sort of, regresses into that feeling that, well, what have I become, and what is there for me to do now? But I guess,
Hold, let
part of
me
me,
interrupt you for just a second here,
yeah.
because I felt like the book was slightly inconsistent in this area. And I'll tell you why. Because the Sith there at the Academy ultimately had Coder, what's his name? Codir, it starts with the Q. Master of
Cordis.
the Cordis, thank you. Cordis
Mhm.
ultimately didn't have an issue with Bane destroying Foharg because he was pursuing his passion. He destroyed the weak or whatever. Okay. But then when Bane lost his passion, Cordis basically prohibited anybody from training him anymore. He was a pariah. He was an outcast in this situation. But then Kasim prevents him from being killed by Sirak outright during this duel. Why? It seems like to me the same rule should have applied. But maybe it is because Kasim saw something that's unrecognized in Bane that he wanted to develop. I don't know. But the point being is that Foharg was a Sith apprentice as well, but they just basically excused him being killed and didn't bat an eye about it. And now Bane is being protected. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and that was one of my questions that I was going to ask you is,
Mhm.
why did the masters decide to keep him Bane at this academy after all of this? Because there's been so much mention of all of these different academies on other worlds where dark side users, or, Sith apprentices, if you will, are kind of channeled into various job titles, I guess you could
Mhm.
say. So, because Bane himself started out in the Gloomwalkers, so why did they keep him at the academy if, that was reserved for the ultimate in the Brotherhood, if they didn't see any potential in him anymore? Or was it just to, further, I don't know, ridicule him and demean him? But what would be the purpose of that? So that, I go back and forth between those ideas and, what his value actually is, because even and again, we're kind of skipping around a little bit, but even in the conversation between Khan and Cordis, they talk about on the ship or Kopej, sorry, that, Kopej is really very much up in arms about the fact that he doesn't think that things are progressing the way that they should with the Jedi, and we'll get all through all of this as it is. But the thing of it is that he's told that's what makes him useful to the Brotherhood, not what makes him valuable, what makes him useful. So there's this whole code, obviously, in the Brotherhood that it's not about what they value, it's about how they can use you. So why did they keep Bane there? That's what my
See,
little,
yeah,
yeah.
this whole Brotherhood is flawed. It is so
Right.
incredibly flawed. I mean,
Mhm.
we all understand why they did it, which is because it's ultimately what leads to the rule too, that when under the old regime of Sith, they were so busy fighting each other that they could not put up an organized resistance to the Jedi. They could not conquer the galaxy because you would have the lesser apprentices teaming up, defeating the master, and then they were incapable of standing up against the most powerful Jedi. That's an oversimplification, but you get what I'm saying. And so they basically said, well, instead of fighting each other, let's fight the Jedi, take over the galaxy, and we'll divide it up. And, we can all see what's happening. If they had been successful, they just would have turned on each other again at some point. But this comes up over the course of the chapters that, Kasim basically is having a conversation with Bane, and and Bane points out, it's like, you're all supposed to be equals, and Kasim acknowledges that, yes, but it's more useful if we defer to Cordis here.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
similarly, that type of thing happens with the Brotherhood of Darkness on Ruusan, is that you've got Khan making his plans to defeat the Jedi, and Kopej pointing out flaws in this, but eventually they have to defer to someone to be in charge, and that creates resistance and more fractures in this whole organization. And so it doesn't really work. It's based on this trust that they don't actually have for each other,
Right.
where you
Yeah.
take an actual army, and you put a general atop, and everyone defers to the general because he's the general. You don't have
Uh-huh.
20 generals all in the room on the battle deferring to each other in this situation. And so they have, yes, they have hierarchy, but there's like too many different people in parts of the hierarchy. And so it's kind of like the Sith really need one guy in charge in order for it to work. And that one guy has to be so supremely more powerful than everybody else so that he can exert his will over all of them. And that's
Mhm.
part of the reason why this is ultimately all going to fall apart, and they're having these problems along the way. But man, we strayed off the academy discussion, didn't we? So
It's all good. So
yeah.
let's finish up chapter 13 with what happens with the introduction here of Githany and the battle over Ruusan, because it's
Mhm.
kind of like, why does everyone want to go back to Jakku? We always keep coming back to Ruusan. Well, it's because it's a very strategic leverage point for each side. So it's kind of this located on the edges of the outer rim, and it creates sort of a border
Uh-huh.
between what is considered the core and the frontier. So it's kind of this tennis match of wins and losses between the Jedi and the Brotherhood. And so one will win here, the other one will win there. But then what happens is they're currently kind of in this third set. And like I was saying, Kopej is getting really frustrated. He wanted to give up until Khan reassures him that the Jedi compassion is a weakness because they're spending time and troops defending these civilians. But Kopej still thinks that it's suicide regardless of Khan's reassurances. So this is like Q Githany. This is where she comes in. She's this Jedi spy. So, Khan has very much put his chips onto this particular Jedi gone rogue and turned to the dark side. And he even states, remarkable, isn't she? Because she
Mhm.
has this presence about her that she's just striking in her, not only her appearance, but in the way that she sort of commands a room with
Yeah.
her presence. And so, how do you feel about this first interaction? Because obviously Khan is almost introducing her like a prized horse, kind of thing. So, I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
how do you feel about that?
I always get a little uncomfortable when they talk about Githany because men lust after her, women are jealous of her in the
Mhm.
situation. And then Khan puts a familiar hand on her hip to like direct her to somewhere, when she has to give him a report. And then we see Bane's reaction to her later in the next chapter when he's kind of like, I don't want to say taken with her, but he sees the allure, and it impacts him, infects him a little bit as well, but he overcomes it. So it just is kind of a, I don't know. It like I said, it makes me a little uncomfortable because I'm like, it's like this massive sex symbol in the middle of the Star Wars
Mhm.
book, and it's almost like she's just too. And then we'll go on to find out about how she's had physical relationships that were frowned upon by the Jedi, and she talks about them freely. And I'm not against that. I mean, if the men can talk about it, the women should be able to talk about it as well. But it's primarily this one character in the book, and so it just is. I get it. On the one hand, Carpesian needed a character that could draw that much attention and have that much of an impact on all the other characters. But at the same time, it's just like it almost feels like, well, we were talking about the Mandalorian and Grogu and the violence on there. Like, what is the rating? When this character comes in, I'm like, what's the rating of this book? I mean, it's is kind of the way I feel about it. It can be a bit not raunchy, but almost too steamy. It's just as a I don't know. Am I making too much of this? Is it a little overdone to you, or what do you think? I've been eager to get your interpretation of that all day.
Yeah, no, and for me, obviously as a woman, I see it more as a way that she uses her ability to control the males around her as
Uh,
more of a weaponized perception, and I think that honestly, it had to be a woman for this story to work the way that it did, especially later on with Bane, because he also immediately sort of falls into the trap of her allure. You
mhm.
think about Helen of Troy and, she what she did, and Cleopatra and what she did, and the way that men responded to that, and so she's a dark side user that uses that to her advantage. Does it make it right? I mean, we're talking dark side here. What is right? What
Yeah,
but it doesn't bother me per se, but I can definitely see where you're going because she does talk very specifically, especially about this Keel Charney and her relationship where she got the information from the Jedi, and that's how she became their spy.
right. Okay. So let me be clear about this. It's that, yeah, you could have an attractive woman in this position, but I almost feel like her other traits are so secondary to her physical beauty in this thing is basically, I guess, what I'm wondering about, because it's like, like, look, Bane is this huge guy, and he's also incredibly smart, and he's
Mhm.
super powerful in the Force. But the thing they keep telling us about Githany is that how beautiful she is, how she turns every head in the room, how gorgeous she is, how everyone's lusting after her, and she's conniving, and she's got that. But it seems like that's such a distant second, I guess, is what I'm pointing out
Mhm.
about that. And so I don't know. Maybe I am just being a bit squeamish in all of this, but I can't help but feel there's a slight amount of sexism going on when it comes to this character, that perhaps they could have emphasized her intellect a little bit more in all of
Mhm.
this, and it got us a little bit more behind her and her plotting, because she comes in, and when Khan's introducing her, and it's Kopech's like, how'd you find out this information? And she basically says that her and the guy she got it from were close. Okay.
Right.
And then later, she's always using her feminine charms to get her way. I'm like, well, why couldn't she just been smart, and use some other powers of persuasion in order to get this type of thing? That's all. That, I guess, that's the larger point I'm trying to make. I don't have her. I don't have a problem. I mean, we see characters like this all the time. You think of Marvel Comics and Black Cat, and then in DC is Catwoman. These bombshells that show up in these things like that, and it's been part of our popular culture for a while. But again, it's just as a, it seems, I don't want to say it's over the top, but it's so emphasized here.
Mhm. And I do think that it's a little bit more explicit, particularly in this book, because
Hmm.
Githany really is smart. I mean, she's got a lot of
Yeah.
talent. She's teaching Bane in the next chapters we're gonna get to, and essentially training him in a lot of these dark side sorts of tricks and tools and abilities. But, I guess it's a little bit more explicit in this book, but I can't help but to think of even Asajj Ventress in Dark Disciple and the way that she utilized her physical prowess, because she even joked about at one point, she was going to pull out the full gambit, kind of
Right.
thing.
But Jay, would you say that's like her number one thing? I mean,
No.
with Ventress, it's always been her prowess, her,
Mhm.
in combat and her ability to be things. Think about, and this is getting way ahead, but the end of the book, and the character that features Nick predominantly in the next book, Zana, who
Mhm.
is also
Yeah,
attractive, but
and
so,
uses
so
it.
much more. It's just as we know
Uh-huh.
we know Caprician's capable, and so maybe as we're talking about this, I'm starting to realize that this character being one dimensional in the grand scope of the Bane trilogy, says something about her. That she's trading on this one thing as opposed to developing all of her other skills. But again, I'm just thinking of other powerful characters that we know that are in this same, that are in Bane's orbit. And anyways, this just stands out to me, but we've really hijacked the conversation of this book with spending a lot of time on that one attribute of her.
Well,
So
I think it's important though, because it
yeah.
does lay the groundwork for, like I was saying, the relationship between she and Bane later on,
Mhm.
and the way that things evolve with treachery and control and power and loyalty and, and. So, I think that it is important to frame her in the way that, garners a lot of discussion. So we'll come back to her actually here in just a second, because she also plays a role, like we said, with Bane's retraining in starting in chapter 14. So did you want to say anything else about chapter 13 or anything else before we move on?
No, we're 30 minutes of the conversation. We really need to get to
Yeah,
chapter
so
14.
and I think we bled some of the things together
Yeah.
that we can kind of, glide over here in just a second. So, with chapter 14 beginning, Bane it starts off with this news of a great victory on Ruusan, but Lord Hoth survived, much to the dismay, of course, of the Brotherhood. So Bane took 3 weeks of back to tank sessions to fully heal from this beatdown that he got from Sirak. So this
Mhm.
was some major stuff. And so he realizes at this point, once again, that he is the focus of rejection and ridicule of all the students. I mean, they kind of talk underneath their breath as he passes, and his demeanor really did retract inward, and he almost regressed to his emotional withdrawal as a young boy in the minds of Apatros. So he
Mhm.
mentions that it's like this regression for him. But he, as you mentioned earlier, he decides he's going to return to the library and he's going to give himself over to studying. And they even drop a little Naga Sadao with alchemy and poisons. He's reading about that. And then again, enter Githany. So she takes note and she's watching him in the archives, and she sees this imposing figure with this hood, and she kind of sees him as weak and broken, but she still senses the dark side in him, and she notes his vulnerability, and then once again decides that she's going to use him as a tool
Yeah.
for her advance of power against Sirak. So she wants to be able to promote herself to one of the most powerful in the Sith at the archive, or at the academy. So as Bane is progressing through his studies, it focuses more on him specifically, and he notes the use of the Darth title in a work by Darth Revan. And
Mhm.
he instantly becomes intrigued by why the title had fallen into disuse. So, this is the first time that we really are seeing Bane contemplating the idea of this Darth title, and it actually kind of physically affects him in a way. And so Githany has this instant power over him as well, and that when she walks in, and it causes him to react to her physically as well. So he doesn't understand why his pulse all of a sudden starts to quicken while she's around. And so to your point, it's kind of this focus on her ability as the femme fatale more so than her actual brains. But she uses that and asks or pleads for his help in learning how to defeat Sirak. So one thing I got to give her credit for is that she's never truly dishonest with Bane. She kind of lays it all out in the beginning and says that she wants to be able to defeat him and that she can help Bane to get his gift back and that she can actually sense his power. So, how do you feel about that as far as she wasn't dishonest with him and she didn't say that I'm going to use you as a tool, but yet she's also saying that I can help you if you help me.
Right. So I think it's great that we just had Maul Shadowlord come out not too long ago, and basically Maul did something similar, with Devon in that series, which is he recognized someone with ability, with someone who had untapped potential that he could turn into a weapon. I mean, it was a very similar way that we heard Maul talk about her, and Githany's talking about Bane here, which is that she has ambition, but she can't do it all on her own. She's going to need to fashion a weapon, and she sees Bane as being that weapon. On the very low level, it is that she needs to get past Sirak, and Sirak's got two cronies following him everywhere. So she needs someone. And Bane's broken. He's someone that she can manipulate the easiest right now, and she can do it in secret. If she's going to try and use any other apprentice in the academy, everyone's going to notice because they're all walking around. Bane's walking around with his head down, and he goes and he hides in the library. She knows where to find him, and she knows about his past. So there's that. But I think it is a wise choice on her part. She just has to get past the barrier that he's thrown up around his passion.
Yeah, and she actually kind of convinces him by taking his hands and sort of puts him into this trance that taps into his emotions and his hatred. And he also kind of feels the stirrings of the force. So she's obviously powerful in that way. And he's like, how did you do that? And she explains that the power is an experience that she also had when she lost her connection with the force. And her master had to help her. So do you think that was a bunch of malarkey? Or do you think that she really did have sort of a kindred spirit in Bane?
I think she. No, I think she was trying to relate to Bane to try and to forge a connection, and I doubt she went through anything like what he's going. I mean, his was the result of getting the daylights beat out of him, and hers was nothing like that. And so she's forging a connection by coming up with some sort of a common experience, and so she can help him overcome that. But did she experience anything to his degree? No, I don't believe that for a second. But what do you
Mhm.
think?
Mhm. Yeah, I don't think so either because obviously her upbringing was very different. I mean, she
Mhm.
even divulges that to Bane that she was at the Jedi Temple very young, and which tracks with what we know about children being brought into the Jedi Temple early. But Lord Khan seems to think that she was born of the dark side, and that's why she ended up with them. So Githany kind of gives Bane this breadcrumb, if you will, of tapping into his force power, and then she offers to train him behind the master's backs. And then she drops this other line that I think sells it for Bane. She says, in the end, those who survive are the ones who look after themselves. And it
Mhm.
instantly brings him back to what Groshek said to him back in, the first chapters when he was leaving Apatros, which was the survivors are those who know how to look after themselves. Right. So
Yeah.
it's almost like the identical phrasing. And so I think that maybe Bane took that as sort of a force sign that, okay, maybe I should go with this and trust her. At least trust her as far as I can throw her, kind of thing. So he agrees
Right.
to the deal. He does ask her why she left the Jedi, and she kind of teases him with that little breadcrumb and says, I'm not quite ready to share that with you. So we know she plans to use him as a tool. She's fascinated by him, though. She knows it's dangerous, but she acknowledges his power, which is kind of latent at this point. But also, she thinks she can control it, which I think is a very dangerous decision on her part, obviously.
Mhm.
So at this point, Bane decides to visit Kasim and asks him for training. And like you had mentioned earlier, he at first he appeals to his pride, but then he basically says, I want to do this for revenge. So Kasim was ready to say no until he said that. Like he wants to make Sirak pay. And so Kasim says, all right, we're going to do this. So that concludes chapter 14. And I think chapter 15 we'll be able to get through a lot more quickly here.
Yeah, I
We've
want to
already
make a
touched
comment
upon
though.
some things. I was just going to ask, what would you like to add?
Yeah, Kasim is an interesting character, and it's been a while since I've read this book. But one of the things that's standing out to me here is that he is a little different than the other Sith masters who they're all about the galactic conquest. And I'm not saying that Kasim's not interested in that at all, but what he really seems to be more interested in is for lack of a better description, the baser passion of things. Because you're right, Bane sneaks into this room and Kasim, it's like, well, we're forbidden from talking to you, but he doesn't immediately throw Bane out. He lets him in to the room and he hears Bane out, and Bane can see him considering it, like, because this has been what Kasim has been hoping for, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which earlier it was Kasim, in earlier chapters, Kasim got frustrated with Bane because Bane was not giving into his passion. He was not giving into his anger, his hate, so he could engage the dark side of the Force and learn everything that Kasim had to offer. Kasim, and when Bane finally says he wants revenge, it's like Kasim's like, yes, isn't it going to be delicious? We're going to love this. It has nothing to do about going out and conquering the galaxy or doing what's best for the Brotherhood. It is this, Kasim has got his own axe to grind against the other Sith masters, which is, the other things that Bane sells him on is like, if Cordis doesn't know that you're training me, then he can't take any credit for my success later when we pull it off, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's all these different parts of the Sith code, but if Kasim is like highlighted one, underlined it, and circled it, it's the whole thing about peace is a lie. There's only passion, and he,
Yeah.
and so when Bane says that, it's like, Kasim's like, yes, that's exactly what I want to hear. Let's do this. And
Right.
there's nothing else beyond that. It's get the revenge. And then it's like, let's find someone else to get revenge against. That's the time Kasim, well, there's other motivations, but that spoils later chapters of the book. But,
Mm-hmm.
at any rate, no, I like the uniqueness of Kasim for this reason. While all the other Sith Lords are squabbling about how to defeat the Jedi and whatever, Kasim is like, how do we use our passion? How do we fight? How do we get better at doing these things? So, anyways, that's my
Yeah.
observation about
Yeah.
him.
No, I love Kasim, and he's
Mhm.
actually out of all the Brotherhood like masters, he's my favorite one. And I
Mhm.
think a lot of it comes back to what you said about his idea of the passion of the dark side, and that he's
Mhm.
more of that true acolyte, if you will, of what that actually is. And I think Bane also senses that too, but he still is trying to like use the little chess pieces to get him to agree to it. But like you said, it's in the end, it's like, yeah, this revenge is what's gonna do it for us. And Kasim jumps in with both feet. But I think he also really felt something for Bane from the very
Mhm.
beginning when he met him, in that he just saw his potential. He knew how smart Bane was. He knew what type of a dark side energy he had. So I think that he played into that as well. So that's pretty
Yeah,
cool.
well, there's something Bane can also give Kasim that we're not ready to talk about at this point in the book.
Right.
It'll come up in later chapters, and
Exactly.
it's only Bane it can possibly do that. So, but that's
Yes.
a discussion for later, and a really
Yes.
vicious tease for everybody because we're not going to get to that for like another 12 chapters. So, anyway.
I know, and it's so hard to, like, dance around some of these things, as you alluded to earlier, even in some of the subsequent books of different parallels, because, we know what's gonna happen, but if this is the first time that some of our listeners are reading this, we definitely don't wanna give too much away. So,
Mhm.
let's jump into chapter 15, because this is truly where Bane's transformation starts to take place. So Bane is training basically around the clock, and his training is become threefold. So he's got Githany helping him with peeling away that veil that's covering his dark side abilities and giving him more force development. Then, of course, we have Kasim, who's training him in lightsaber combat and mastery. And what's funny is that neither Kasim nor Githany are at this point are aware that the other is helping Bane as well. And
Mhm.
so then the third aspect of this for Bane is the ancient texts. So he's reading them whenever he's not doing the other two, which is giving him his philosophical evolution and teaching him more about his place in Sith history, essentially, and where he wants to take that into the future. So, he's definitely progressing quickly. What I think is really cool though about Bane, and this just shows where he places what he's doing in the hierarchy of I'm doing this for the long game, so to speak. He's hiding his metamorphosis from everyone, and he's actually valuing the anonymity that it's giving him at the academy because the other students are basically ignoring him and they've written him off. So, at this point, though, which one of those three training methods that I just mentioned, the force development from Githany, Kasim's lightsaber mastery, or the ancient texts, which one do you think ultimately ends up shaping Bane the most? That's a tough question, but which one do you think?
Well, I think there's a common theme with all three of them there. And it's that, we were talking about how Bane ultimately ended up in the library. And this is before Githany came and talked to him. And he realized that, he's afraid of his fear. He's afraid of what he's capable of. And so he started to get into the text and he could kind of feel in the background there was a little bit of that spark that started to rekindle. And then Githany helped bring him out a bit about that. And then the idea of revenge that he proposed to Kasim. So I think it's the training that he's getting from all three are really just doing the same thing. They're helping him engage with that passion, helping him engage with that dark side in a way that none of them, not the holders of the ancient texts, not Githany, not Kasim, can do individually. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, this is a cop out answer. I realize, they're all equal, Jay. No, but the point is that they're all in their way accomplishing the same goal, helping him engage his passion again in this. Because what has Kasim told him in the past? It's you don't need, you're learning forms so that the force can take over. And Githany is helping him go through the motions of how to use a force power so that the passion can take over and magnify it beyond abilities she can use. And then the same thing with the ancient texts is that it's not so much that the ancient texts, they're giving him ideas, but it's ultimately his passion that he's pouring into it that's allowing him to master those things in it.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I think that's the answer I've arrived at.
Mhm. Well, they're all cogs in the machine, right? I mean, so
Mm-hmm.
you can't truly have one without the other. But I think what does set him apart is the philosophical evolution by studying the ancient texts, because that's something that none of the other students, regardless of their innate abilities, pays
Mm-hmm.
any attention to. So it kind of alludes to that even a little bit more, I think, when Kasim is training Bane with the lightsaber combat and he pulls out the two blades. And Bane is really questioning him about the advantage of the double blade. And so, as you had pointed out, Kasim is kind of telling him that he needs to do these things so he's not thinking about what's happening. He's just using the force to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But he basically tells him that, in combat, your mind tries to keep track of each blade separately. And it's kind of a good metaphor for analyzing how to strategize opponents and have all of these moving parts happening at the same time. And so Bane basically says, "Oh, like Githany's whip, you don't anticipate these kinds of things." So it's really utilizing the knowledge that Bane is possessing, not only through what he's being taught through Githany and what he's being taught through Kasim and through what he's being taught with the texts. So again, they're all kind of cogs in the machine. But I think it's the why that's
Mm-hmm.
exposed. The knowledge is the power, regardless of where it's coming from. He just needs to figure out how best to use it. And
Yeah.
that's what makes him so powerful. So, yeah. So, and again, I just love the way that Bane is keeping everything on the down low. Nobody knows what the other one is doing. He doesn't even sleep. And he even mentions that the way he's keeping himself sustained is just through meditation. And so he's getting his energy back through all of the meditation instead of actually sleeping. So we
Well,
move
that's
on. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. I was gonna say that's actually it's formative for him eventually becoming the Sith Master, right? Because the whole point is that he will possess the knowledge. It's up to the student to crave it, but the master doles out how he gets the knowledge. So what he's doing is, in this case, is that not that he already possesses it, but he's not telling everybody else where he's getting it from, so they can't
Mhm.
replicate his result. And ultimately, he will dole that out to a future apprentice in a similar type fashion, which is that, you know, yeah, I got a lot to teach you, but I'm going to do it on my own time schedule in this situation. And so, right, I mean, he's not going to give anyone else the answers to the test. And anyways,
Mhm.
that's just it occurred to me that this is like kind of the starting block for that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great observation. And I really got to give it to Bane in this way because he is making all the right moves for truly keeping, like I said, keeping everything on the down low until that right moment. And that's just, it's just wicked smart, which is what Bane does.
Mhm.
So Githany is also teaching Bane how to use different abilities like force lightning, for example. And I think that the phrase that where she warns him not to be consumed by his power is very metaphorically speaking as well, because, it's kind of foreshadowing a lot of different things that could potentially happen to someone who is consumed by the power that they're trying to wield. But you can just tell from this situation that Bane is just reveling in this particular skill. And Githany is almost taken aback by this just a little bit. Like it almost concerns her that what she's seeing. Um, and so how do you think she's feeling about him as a student? Because she's not even telling him what she thinks of his progression, but she is amazed by it. So how do you think she's feeling at this point other than that?
She's created a monster. Is what it comes down. I mean, her plan was to build Bane up as a weapon. And, you put this question in our note: is she helping him or consciously managing him? Yes.
Mhm.
The answer to that question is
Yes.
yes. Is the and the thing is that she really expected to build Bane back up, and then that was going to be her backup for when she takes on Sirak. And she also did not anticipate that he was going to surpass her so quickly. So so when she things like, don't become consumed by your power, that's the whole trying to manage him right there, which
Mhm.
is, she'll think, oh, that's really good. You made progress, Bane. And what she's not saying is like, you surpassed me by a lot in this situation. Because she's talking about how, there he is creating this tempest in the library where like Sirak was able to create some bolts and cast them from here to there.
Right.
And he's created this entire storm. And so she can't let him know right now that he has surpassed her, because then what's he going to do? It's like, what do I need you for? Right. I mean,
Mhm.
that's the whole way this academy works right now. So yeah, she's helping him for her own ends, but she, like I said, she's created a monster. He's already surpassed her, and she can't let him know that. Otherwise,
Yeah.
he takes over the scheme.
Right. And I think she's also noticing too at this point that with him studying the texts, she's wondering if it's actually giving him an advantage. So
Mhm.
she's thinking to herself, maybe he's on to something here. And so I think you're right about cautiously managing him as well as helping him, and that it is a little bit of both for sure.
Right. And
So,
she knows that she can't do what he's doing because he would notice.
right.
And and then the gig would be up. I mean, it's she's kind of in a, if she was going to do that, she needed to do it before he's reached levels of power, and then so that she could have tried to take advantage of looking at the same text that he is and take credit for some of that knowledge. But
Mhm.
it's a little too late for that now.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. So then we get into the scene where, again, kind of a weird little, I don't know if I would say uncomfortable necessarily, but Bane starts massaging Githany's shoulders, and he talks about how he knows how to do that because of, mining on a Patros and
Hmm.
having all of the sore muscles and whatnot. But it's this kind of tender moment between them. I don't know if tender is the right word, but
No, it's not.
where they have a little bit of a connection. And
Yeah.
so she finally opens up to him about why she left the Jedi Order and under what circumstances she left. And she left those breadcrumbs a little bit earlier. So she talks about her master, Master Honda, who also had Keel as a Padawan. And I thought that was kind of interesting because, as we know, typically masters don't have more than one Padawan at a time. But of course, we're
Hmm.
talking legends slash expanded universe here. So his reaction to her relationship with Keel, though, made her realize that the Jedi's Honda's reaction made her realize that the Jedi's beliefs about the Force were a quote unquote perversion of reality in her point of view, and that her true potential would never be reached. So she actually asked Keel to leave with her, and he refused. And then Bane asks if she killed him for it. And then Bane's reply is, "When you finally betray me, I hope you care enough to try to kill me yourself."
Hmm.
And that really sets Githany off. So she's
Hmm.
kind of offended. She lashes out at him and it's almost like appealing to any remaining compassion that he might have, because she's like, "I opened up to you and I was vulnerable." So, do you
She's been
think that
scorned.
she's been scorned.
Hmm.
But do you think that she actually felt that Bane has compassion and that she was keying into that, or was she truly hurt in that point?
No, she was not really hurt.
Yeah.
Uh, he caught on to her scheme. And this is like one of the few people that have in this entire time. We've been talking about this character and how she uses her beauty to sucker punch everyone. She
Mhm.
walked into a room full of Sith, and everyone, all eyes were on her. Their tongues were hanging out of their mouths, their chins were on the floor, and she, as you said earlier, she was controlling the room. She's having this interaction with Bane, and he's massaging her shoulders and her neck, whatever, and she's making all the appreciative sounds. In this case, it's a bit of a seduction in that
Mhm.
case, and he's reacting a little bit to it, and so then she's going on about this story, which, yes, explains her leaving, but also is planting a suggestion that she has these physical type relationships, and she's all the while giving him this reaction here. So the idea is that she's you know promising something almost in a way to Bane. And the thing is that he sees all this for what it is. And so finally, that move when he puts his hands around her neck and says, when you betray me, I hope you care enough to kill me. It's like he's telling her, I see through all of this right now. You may have caught me off guard in the beginning, but I am not the puppy dog following you around that is oblivious to what you're doing in this situation. And Githany makes mention about how she, like, when um in the earlier scene when she first meets Bane and she leaves, she can feel his eyes on her as she leaves, and her hips are swaying. I mean, they use all of
Oh,
that type
yeah.
of language and stuff like that. And
Mhm.
she's used to men's eyes being on her. She's a woman that's chased. She never chases men. And so Bane has completely just thrown her off her game in this type of situation, and she doesn't know what to do with that.
Mhm. Yeah, she actually notes that she felt that she had a loss of control in that moment, but
Uh-huh.
and she acknowledges it, but she's still up for the challenge, and she's even intrigued by it with
Yep.
Bane. But
Mhm.
do you think that there is kind of a blind spot with Githany for Bane?
How so?
Just because of the fact that well, again, I don't wanna lead on too much to what ends up happening later, but
Mhm.
that he excuses certain things with her, and then that becomes a blind spot for him down the road. Do you see where I'm going with
Um,
that without revealing
yeah,
too
yeah. I
much?
mean, and the thing is, to really answer that question, I'm gonna actually have to reread some of those chapters. But my memory is this: is that I think he has hopes for her. The relationship right now is that it's not perfectly this, but the easiest way to explain it is that she intends to be the master in this relationship and bring Bane along as the henchman who could ultimately be disposable in that case. He's going to flip that script and have hopes for her fulfilling that same role that she has for him in mind. We'll leave that part of the discussion there.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to give her a lot of chances. And you can read ahead and see how that all works out. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway,
True that.
I don't, to the extent to answer your question more directly, is it a blind spot? No, I don't think so. I think he has his hopes up, but I think we're going to find out soon enough that he also understands that it's not going to work out to his satisfaction. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah,
No, good points.
we may have
And I
given away too
love,
much there, but
yeah.
anyway.
Well, I love the way that the chapter ends because they give this very specific physical reaction that Githany does where she bites her bottom lip and she contemplates
Mhm.
what has just happened. So you almost are left wondering, who's seducing who at this point, with the way that this particular chapter ended. So you got to keep that little tell in mind for later on. That's all I'm going to say about the
Yep,
biting the
yep.
bottom lip thing. So, all right. So I have to ask you though, do you think that these chapters with Bane's essential death, the baptism in the Bacta tank, and then his rebirth and transformation in chapter 15, do you think that this is the true birth of Darth Bane, or do you think that's still to come?
Um, hmm. That's a good question because huh, I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question because I would say that, him getting to the academy and realizing he has a greater potential was actually the very first step in him becoming Darth Vader. And I'm not talking about just the Sith, but and I don't have all the steps in mind, but it is a defined step in the development of this type of an archetype. And so all of these things were necessary. He had to be broken down. He had achieved some success, but then he had to be broken down so he could achieve the next level, the ultimate level of success. And so to that extent, yes, this is where the idea maybe of Darth Bane could be born, but he was already on that path prior to this, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Because he was
Mhm.
already questioning the brotherhood and the way that everything was structured. But I
Yeah.
do think that these three chapters definitely give us a lot more of the DNA structure, I guess you could say, of Darth Bane than we've gotten, to this point. Because I think that he's really learning that true power is hidden, it's patient, it's very intellectual as well as physical, and it's also very deeply personal as well. And so this is those seeds that are being planted there, but it's also he's going to have to definitely navigate these different relationships that he has between he and Githany, he and Kasim, he and the Brotherhood, and where his role actually ultimately ends up, which will
Mhm.
be in subsequent chapters.
Indeed.
So, yeah. So, anything else you want to say before we wrap it up?
No, no, it's uh, I guess just this. I was dreading chapter 13, but looking forward to chapter 15. Because the
I
him
understand.
yeah, him getting beaten down and,
Yeah.
you know, being beaten to an literally, being beaten into an inch of his life and then only, I was like, that chapter's never comfortable. And then, but to see him like start to redevelop and assert himself is something that's always fun to read. So yeah,
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 absolutely. And I'll tell you what, the audiobook really does a great job of making you feel it too, because of course they have the sound effects
mhm,
and some of the other intonations to the voice that sometimes you don't always get. So I always do the, hooked on phonics version, if you will, where I
right.
read it and then I have the audio on a little faster so I can keep up with it. But then I'm constantly pausing, of course, to write notes and things too. So, but this was fun. It's always great to revisit, and it always makes me think about more questions every time we dive into these segments. So hopefully everybody listening also found a lot of great things to contemplate as well. So I think that's a great place to end. So thank you all for joining us for this episode of Podcast Stardust and this installment in our Darth Bane book club. So if you want to get more of this, you can always look back on our previous episodes. We started this at the very beginning of the year, and we will be continuing until we are finished with the book. So you can look for those episodes in the future. And while you're at it, you can subscribe to the show. And the best place to do that actually is on retrozap.com. And you can find all kinds of other places, or other podcasts, I should say, to listen to as well. And so if you subscribe to Podcast Stardust, you can get all the other great shows on RetroZap, which includes Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Case Files, Animanicast, Brews and Blasters, Dork Lair, Dooncast, Enjoy Stuff, Love, Death, and Robots Plus, Superhero Suite, and Warp Trails. So we'd love it if you like, rate, and subscribe there. And also on Apple Podcasts, which is a great one for boosting us up the algorithms. And we'll also take any ratings and reviews anywhere you listen to your podcasts. And Dennis does a great job of literally getting us everywhere that we need to be, including places like Audible and Spotify, and a few other places that he's going to tell you about in just a second here. And so while you're at it, Dennis, why don't you tell everybody where we can be found on social media?
Right. So we are primarily found on Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust. So we have some pages over on Pinterest. Are they called pages? I don't know what they're called, but I don't use Pinterest. But Jack, you set us up over there. Yeah, boards. There you go. And then the show is also available on YouTube and YouTube Music. It's audio only, but it publishes to both. So there you go. If you've got something more to say that doesn't fit ideally on social media, or reach out to us via email at podcaststardust@gmail.com. And if you're looking for some Podcast Stardust merch, t-shirts, caps, that type of thing, stickers, you can head over to TeePublic, and the link for that is in the show notes. So, Jay, why don't you go ahead and remind everybody what you got going on in cosplay?
Absolutely. So you can always catch me over my Instagram, which is at j.snipscosplay. So mainly Ahsoka, but I also do lots of other things. So I just did an appearance recently as my original concept Mandalorian, which is based on Tahiri Vela from Legends. So if you're a big Legends fan, she's definitely my favorite character from Legends. Well, one of them, but she's definitely up there. Then we've got Ahsoka, Hera, the Fourth Sister, and lots of other things as well. So once again, that is at j.snipscosplay. So Dennis, why don't you tell everybody what we've got coming up on the show?
Sure. So before I get into the next couple shows, just some guidance for the book club going forward. The next couple months, we're going to be doing 2 chapters at a time as opposed to 3. So for next month, look at chapter 16 and 17, and that'll be coming towards the end of June. But as for the next next couple episodes, rather, on Friday, the current plan is to wrap up the week with a look at recent Star Wars news. And then on Monday, it will be the next episode in our Clone Wars rewatch, which will actually be season 4, episode 1. We previously recorded a show covering the last 2 episodes of season 3, so I'll try to remember to rebroadcast those for y'all. But if not, you can find them in the catalog over on retrozap.com. So, thanks for listening to episode 1042 of Podcast Stardust, everyone. Have a great rest of your week, and until next time, may the Force be with you. Peace is a lot.